For those who want, my hope is to be able to get through these slides fairly quickly, and then at the time and then entertain any questions. Now, at least a couple of the slides are going to bring up topics that could be another 20-slide discussion, and so I'm going to ask you to try to get through things. I'm going to ask you to try to take note and then try to bring the questions afterwards. And then, as I said, I'm willing to stay as long as if there's a couple people who want to, who still have questions or want to do some more discussion, that we can do that. But for the most part, I'm giving you. Let's see. It'll probably help if I see what you guys see. So, to put the TV back on. Yeah, and you have to hit the power and then the exit. Okay. All right. So in order to talk about what the General Conference, which is normally it's an every 4-year meeting of the United Methodist Church. The representatives from the entire body, and it's in various places. The United Methodist Church officially began in 1968 when the Methodist Church of the time and the Evangelical United Brethren came together. So 1972 was the first General Conference where they came together and actually put together what they call our rule book, our book of discipline. Now, the Book of Discipline has a section right at the beginning that's sort of our basic articles of religion, and then some kind of modern theological statement, including what we call social principles, which are kind of our views on some of the social issues of the time. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history, and yeah, just click that so I can. There we go. You probably can't read this, but in 1972, which was the first time that we met, well, then the committee that was presenting different things presented to all the delegates this statement: homosexuals, no less than heterosexuals, are persons of sacred worth who need the ministry and guidance of the church in their struggles for human fulfillment, as well as the spiritual and emotional care of a fellowship which enables reconciling relationships with God, with others, and with self. Further, we insist that all persons are entitled to have their human and civil rights ensured. That was the original report. And then from the floor, someone added this amendment, which passed at that point overwhelmingly. Although we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and consider this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. So that was about 52 years ago, and the battles began. So obviously, some persons were either upset with that last bit of language, and there continued to be debates among the church. But one of the things they also discovered was that as I said, this was social principles. It was a theological statement, so it didn't come with any kind of rule or any kind of anything beyond that. So while it was a statement that some people liked and some people didn't like, it really didn't affect any of the operation of the church. So it wasn't until 4 years later that someone did suggest that we need to put something in the rules. And so they added this rule that no general board, agency, committee, commission, or council that is anything of the wider United Methodist Church shall give United Methodist funds to any caucus or group or otherwise use such funds to promote the acceptance of homosexuality. The Council of Finance and Administration shall have the right to stop such expenditures. Okay, so that was added. So that was a line that a clause that wasn't in our rule book. It was added in there. In the following year, when West Ohio met, well, then somebody brought that up, and they said, well, that rule only applies to general church, and so they said, well, then we should have a rule for West Ohio, and then we had one that was voted into our own West Ohio rules. So 8 years later, there was actually an attempt 4 years later to decide if there was anything specific that needed to be said about pastors. Right now we had they said there was very little in the rule book. Basically, pastors came before their board of ordained ministry, and they were interviewed over a whole variety of things, and then decided whether they would be recommended to the whole body. And ultimately, every pastor that comes through has to be voted on by all of the pastors so every year that I would go to conference, there would be a session where I would be among everybody else who would vote for these persons to become pastors. Now, there were probably about 40 people becoming pastors when I was ordained, which is part of the explanation of how I snuck in there, But so obviously people didn't really know much about me, so they trust the board or whatever to make those kinds of decisions. But then in 1984, they thought, well, we need something more specific. So they added this this was an additional rule. Since the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, self-avowed practicing homosexuals, that would be someone, that you couldn't, you couldn't just accuse somebody of being gay. They'd have to acknowledge that, and they'd have to say that they were in relationship or whatever. So self-avowed practicing homosexuals are not to be accepted as candidates, ordained as ministers, or appointed to serve in the United Methodist Church. So that was a rule added in 1984. Now, some years later, in 1996, well, then we also added this. At that point, this was before same-sex marriage was legal. But ceremonies that celebrate homosexual unions, because there were churches that were doing sort of their own non-legal marriage-type ceremony, that these homosexual unions shall not be conducted by our ministers and shall not be conducted in our churches. It said about a year or two after this happened, well, then I remember somebody saying to me, saying, United Methodist Church, don't you guys do do like homosexual weddings or something? And I said, well, actually, we're the only church that actually has a rule written down that we don't. but that's what got the press. Now, I don't have a year on this, but another piece of this, the fifth piece of this, was that over time, well, then there had to be some specification of, well, how do you deal with this? How do you enforce this? And here, well, then they said that among things that a bishop or a pastor could be tried on if they were charged with things that are incompatible with Christian teaching, including but not being limited to being a self-avowed practicing homosexual or conducting ceremonies which celebrate homosexual unions or performing same-sex wedding ceremonies. There were other pieces that were said about what minimum charges there may be, or how they may kind of deal with that. So those were the five. So those are the 5 points. Then the reason I bring all that up is that when I get to what this general conference did, well, then hopefully that'll make some sense. Now, a couple other things. Just in this 50 years of arguments, there have been a couple of kinds of arguments that have come up, and they said these are things that we could spend a whole afternoon discussing. But one of them is the differences that people have regarding the Bible and gay, lesbian type of issues. That there are 3 basic positions, although the third one has many different variations. That some people believe that the Bible is relevant today, and it clearly applies to all the gay, lesbian issues as we have them. And then there are some who believe that the Bible is no longer relevant. I mean, you and I know that there are not just United Methodist churches, but there are other churches where people don't extol the Bible at all. I mean, I knew a pastor who at one point confessed to me that he said, I think that I could. Sometimes I think that that he preached a lot of self-help, psychology sort of things, and he said, I almost don't need. I realize that I almost don't even need a Bible, and there are Christians who don't see the Bible as being relevant to today's issues at all. But there's a lot of other people that are somewhere in the middle. They believe that the Bible is relevant, but then they may have questions about what parts of the Bible apply, or how do you judge between the Gospels, Paul's letters, and the Old Testament laws, and then the questions about whether gay and lesbian people today are they really the same as what the Bible people were talking about in the first place. So that's one place where we've had a lot of debate over the years. Another is this question, and I think everybody hates the words, but they call it compatibilist or incompatibilist, and that's the question that is it. Well, the bottom line is that how much do you stay with a church when you disagree with things? And in our church, there probably is almost something something about the church that people disagree with. There are people who believe that if a church anywhere is conducting same-sex weddings or has a gay pastor, that they're wrong, and I cannot be a part of that church, even if it's not happening here, if it's happening in California or whatever, I can't be part of that. Now there are some who believe that that's if that's happening somewhere else, it is wrong, but I don't have any control of that. It's still and that may be something that we can eventually come to an agreement, or maybe can convince them that it's wrong, and they can still be a part of that, and so I can still be a part of that church. And then on the other side, of course, there's persons who believe the other thing. It's said that there are persons who have left the United Methodist Church over the years who say that a church should be conducting same-sex, should be allowing gay persons to have pastors, and if any church is not allowing that, I can't be a part of that church, and so forth. So that's another area again that we could have a long discussion about. So I'm getting to the day, but in 2016 was our last official book of discipline before the one that is going to be published now. It's not yet, but but based on the work of the General Conference, it will be published shortly. And it has a couple of things in the social principles. Again, these are the statements that don't carry any kind of enforcement rate or anything like that, but just represent what people could agree was the basic position of the church. And so as far as marriage was concerned, it said although persons are sexual beings, whether or not they are married, sexual relations are affirmed only in the covenant of monogamous heterosexual marriage. And then and you can't read that at all, but this is just the updated version of that statement about homosexuality from 1972. It's added a few verses, but it still continues that the United Methodist Church does not condone the practice of homosexuality and considers this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. Okay, now in the years that followed, in 2016. There was the decision to have a special General Conference in 2019. Normally they're every 4 years. And this one was specifically to deal with this question. Now there were a lot of persons in this country who had the idea that the church was going to change its position. That they were at least going to drop some of the what they call the restrictive language on gays and on same-sex weddings, and something like that was going to happen. But when that conference met, it actually reaffirmed all of those 5 areas that we talked about. And they also created they also had a paragraph that created a particular kind of a way for churches to leave the denomination if they decided that their conscience would not allow them to stay. Now, ironically, the plan that passed was the plan that was to keep everything the way that the church has always said. The assumption then was that the churches that were going to leave were the ones who disagreed with that. But it turned out to be the opposite. And part of the reason it did was, let me not get too far ahead of myself. Just a reminder that this exit allowed churches to maintain their assets, that is their property and the money and their buildings and so forth, if they paid off existing loans to the denomination, if they paid their apportionments for the current year and following, and if they paid their share of the pension liability. For some small churches, those were actually very small amounts. Some of the small churches had hardly anything in the pension liability because they never had full-time pastors, and because they were small, their apportionments were small. So that may have been a rather small amount. We figured for us it was somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000. Now, for whatever reason, I don't know what their thinking was, but they made this provision and they set it to expire on December 31st, 2023. So now, so what I told you before, when in an earlier report on this, was that churches have 3 basic ways to, or at least had 3 basic ways to separate from the denomination. But the last one now would no longer, assuming there was no longer apply. And that is to disband. That is, the church can always close. Then you forfeit all of your assets, but then you can start a church anywhere you want, and under any name that you want. You can affiliate with an approved denomination, and there's actually 2 pieces of that. That could mean either joining. There are particular denominations that you can join. There probably is some cost involved in that. It's probably something similar to the disaffiliation process. But you can actually merge with a church of another denomination. That does happen sometimes. In both of those cases, you have to actually have approval from the other group. Obviously, if you're going to merge with another church, they kind of have to want to have you on the one hand, or if you're going to join another denomination, they have to accept you. So what was supposed to happen was we have general conferences every 4 years. So there was going to be a 2020 general conference. And there were persons, it was actually proposed by an African bishop at that point that there was going to, they called it a protocol of separation. That it was there was talk around the various groups that we would sort of divide up the church and allow churches to simply transfer into, so that there would be a traditional church, that there would be a church that actively wanted to recruit gay, lesbian clergy and so forth, and then there was a church that was kind of in the middle of the road or whatever. This didn't happen, and that's partly why I have it in italics here. Since there was a broad consensus, it was assumed that some form of this would have passed in 2020. But 2020, COVID came, and so that 2020 General Conference was postponed and then rescheduled for 2022. And then in early 2022, the Conference Planning Committee canceled the conference and rescheduled it for 2024. One of the things that I'm sure was confusing to the delegates this time around at General Conference was that the General Conference, which took place in 2024, they said was officially the General Conference of 2020. We still haven't had the 2024 General Conference, but that's the kind of legalese kind of stuff that they often argue about. But anyway, when that happened, well, then in May of 2022, a group of United Methodist leaders decided that they could not trust the leadership to even hold the next conference, and they launched the Global Methodist Church. They'd already had come up with a name as it was going to be one of those branches. And they encouraged churches to use the temporary paragraph to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church. Meanwhile, the Book of Discipline 2016 was the operating rule book of the United Methodist Church until this May. And so I have a whole listing in here of basic General Conference actions. General Conference probably voted on over 200 different items, and some of those might be of interest to many of you, but for most of us, the ones that are of interest are along two lines, and this one maybe not even so much so. You may have heard about this idea of regionalization. In simplest terms, it means that right now the United States organizationally is divided up into 5 jurisdictions, and then there are 7 international conferences, and these all have their own separate meetings, and then they have individual groups underneath them that have their meetings. The proposal was to change it to 8 conferences, that there would be the 7 international ones, and then the United States would be its own conference. This actually has been popular with the people outside the United States, because just the way our structure works. One of the things that the General Conference had to do was talk about changes in the United States pension plan. And that means that the Africans and the Filipinos and those others, they all had to learn our pension system in order to be able to vote on it. They would rather not do that. And so in the past, this kind of idea of reorganizing ourselves this way was popular. It failed a couple times. It actually passed one time. But because it's a change in our Constitution, it has to be ratified by the local churches afterwards. So this will come back to the churches. And in the past, it failed. The reason that it failed, though, is because people have assumed that, among other things, this idea of kind of separating the United States from the rest was doing an end run around the whole issue and allowing the United States, because it was more liberal on the issue, to allow for gay, lesbian pastors and for same-sex weddings and so forth. Whereas in some other countries, some of those things are even illegal. And persons have said, we can't have anything that in their discipline that actually promotes something like that, because it would not work in our country, and it would cause us possibly legal problems. The big thing then is these 5 points. Essentially, these things were all dropped. The statement in there that we consider that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, that sentence was simply removed. The thing that said about funding was removed. That the extra line that was added in about self-avowed practicing homosexuals could not be ordained, that was removed. The line that said that same-sex unions or marriages could not be performed in our churches or by our clergy, that was removed, and then any charges related to those things. And then as far as the disaffiliation paragraph, it was set to expire. The General Conference did not renew it. Now, some annual conferences, Missouri, I know specifically, have continued to offer, to their churches a disaffiliation process. So they've gone ahead and they've continued to allow churches to use that. When it came to West Ohio, I'm sorry again for the size of the writing, West Ohio did not address any of the changes at General Conference, and there was no action to continue a disaffiliation process. So officially, at least this year, we do not have that similar process. Just in other things that did happen, we ordained 5 elders and 7 deacons, or 2 deacons, while 31 persons retired. Like I said, when I came in, it was probably about the opposite. We'd have like 30, 40 new pastors, and then maybe about the same number retiring. But then all of the other recommendations or changes in rule changes that had to do with just the changing of different groups change their names, the budget, pension and health, minimum salary. There was just a statement about telling people about the regionalization plan and what that means, a response to Palestinian Christians, an endorsing of a Senate bill on affordable housing. And all of those things I could talk to you at any point about. But then this is the big questions. Where do things go from here? Now, as far as future legislation, that would be anybody's guess. But here are some things that we can reasonably expect, because some of them are already happening, right? That because of the action of the General Conference, there will be no charges against pastors for being LGBTQ. Just about any pastor for whom that complaint had been when someone there have been complaints of other pastors, and they have been worked through in legal channels, but those things have all been dropped. There will be no charges for pastors conducting same-sex weddings. There are pastors who also had complaints filed against that, and that process was happening. That has been dropped. There will be churches that host same-sex weddings, because there have already been churches who have hosted them even when they were not allowed. So we can safely assume that that's happening somewhere. And there will likely be grants given to organizations that might be argued to lobby for LGBTQ issues. Now, it is always possible to find out where conference money is going. I mean, all of that is public information. But in the past, well, then there's always been issues about whether this organization, which was getting United Methodist money, may do a variety of things, may lobby for particular political issues and so forth. So that's probably still going to be happening. A few other things that we might assume may happen is at some point there will likely be district superintendents and bishops who identify as LGBTQ. In some parts of the country there already are. But we can say at some point it may be the case that our district superintendent might be gay, our bishop might be gay. That could well happen. That's at this point is beyond us. And at some point, a bishop, as is their prerogative, might decide to appoint an LGBTQ pastor in a particular setting. Now what people would say, and probably in today's climate, it's probably pretty safe to say, if you were to ask any bishop, they'd say, why would I put a gay pastor into a church that doesn't want it? But then down the road, we might assume that there could be, again down the road, there could be a bishop who is passionate about this issue, or one that has a problem with a particular church, or a problem with a particular pastor, and may decide that this is all well and good. I like to say that never happens, but sometimes, but from my colleagues, I know that sometimes appointments are not always made with what's best for the church and vine. Now, it is not likely that churches or pastors will ever be required to conduct same-sex weddings. Now, I say not likely, but when same-sex marriage was legalized, a prominent pastor made the declaration. He said that churches should stop doing weddings entirely. And his argument is that at some point, depending on your state or whatever, at some point that you might get sued for discrimination because you do these weddings and somebody. I mean, again, he's just forecasting. And I said, well, I can't say that that's not possible because it could happen down the road, but it would depend on a lot of things changing. For right now, no pastor, no church is ever required to do a wedding at all. So it would probably, if something like that were to happen, it would require changes in at least the way the church has handled them, or even the state. So that's why I said it's not likely that we would ever be in that position. But again, what happens years down the road is anyone's guess. So thanks for putting up with all of that. Is there a... we did record this part, and generally in the past when I've done this, well then you have a microphone there for me. Okay. We found that it's very hard to it's very hard to get a good read on the discussion. So in the past I've generally not posted the discussion part, but if there, I've thrown a lot of stuff at you, but I think I think I covered everything. Do you think did I cover everything? So are there any questions? Yes, Mary.
For those churches who wish to go with the global church,
Okay.
what happens to all of the agencies that the United Methodist Church has supported in the past? Where does the funding go that supports our hospitals, that supports our missions, that supports UMCO and all those other things?
I think that my sense is, I can't speak for the Global Methodist Church, but I believe that there's a number of those that they are supporting. But that will be that's ultimately up to them as to whether they support UMCOR or whether they create a similar agency. I know that the United Methodist Women changed their name to United Women of Faith. And part of the idea was that if churches had chosen to disaffiliate, either to become Global Methodist or to be independent, for that matter, that their women's group could still be a part of that group. Now I don't know how much of that's if that's where that's happened, whatever. But at least that was the understanding that some would continue to be. And that was the original idea of this separation that was going to I mean, essentially the churches were going to separate, but there would still be a common, there would still be UMCOR that everybody would, that they would support together and do some shared ministry together. So disagreement on this, but at least trying to work together with other, as we try to work together with other denominations.
Because to me, part of the connectivity of my religion, I needed to be connected with all those other people who had some like feelings, but also that I was connected in all of these activities supported by my church was important to me, still is.
Okay, and I think that's, so what I'm hearing you say is that, of course, that's also, well, what she's talking about, what Marion, if I can paraphrase as well, is was that it's important for her that because we're a worldwide church, that we are connected to these mission, this mission work all over, and that's and that may be that may be a statement not only for remaining United Methodist, or for that matter becoming Global Methodist, because I'm pretty sure, again, I can't speak for the Global Methodists, but I believe that they have that same commitment to worldwide mission. And for that matter, even if the church was independent, we could still connect to these other things. But that's a concern that Marion brought up. Yes, Dave.
Well, when we had our meetings,
Yes.
in the fall, we put off the vote about disaffiliation,
Right.
until they changed the discipline. Okay, and then we could decide about whether we were going to disaffiliate.
Right.
where does that stand? I mean, if we want to join another, like the global, as an example, the global, I mean, that's what, I assume that's what we were going to do. Now it doesn't seem like
Well,
we do that.
and I'm not, and I should qualify that because one piece that I'm not familiar with is if we want to go to the Global Methodist Church, I believe that they have some provision and some assistance toward that, but I'm not aware. I'd have to research that myself. As I said, if we were in another conference, well then we would have we'd have more options than we do. But there are still options. A number of the churches that did disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church did join the Global Methodist Church. A number of them still haven't. They're independent. They may still be independent at this point. They can decide if they want to join the global or if they want to join another denomination, for that matter. But I know that there's at least a few that are still trying to decide that.
Well, my question was, are we still going to meet together and decide what we want to do, what we're going to do?
Well, I think that there's,
That's what I want to
yeah.
know.
My assumption has been that we've got, that this meeting is just one of a few. I mean, the ones that if we do have that discussion, if we had gone through with the disaffiliation process, if we had decided that we really wanted to pursue that at that point, we would have been required to meet with them, with a person from the conference, at least 2 or 3, 4 times. I don't remember how many meetings that they would have, and then lead to a congregational vote. Now, because we're not following that, we can follow it. We can create our own structure, but it's something that we would need to. But there's a lot of little details that go into this that we would need to work through. So it's. I don't see any way for this without being a process, or without feeling at the end that if we do have a congregational vote one way or the other, that people won't feel railroaded or uninformed. There are a lot of the churches that did disaffiliate regretted the decision, not because it wasn't the right decision for them, but because they may have made it very hastily and not realized some of the. I mean, there are not only there are legal issues as well as the issues with the denomination. Now, again, if you disband, well, then you basically throw all that stuff back onto the church, onto the United Methodist Church. But if you do want to continue in some sense, then you have to account for all those as well. I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, I think what we need to have is a series of meetings, is the way I see it.
Like you said, I felt a little bit railroaded because if you understand what I'm saying, I'm not being real negative, but I just.
Yeah, and I felt railroaded too, just because of the, like I said, I don't know what was the thinking when they put a calendar time on that. I mean, of course, they were also assuming that there was going to be another general conference that was going to happen well before that 2023 deadline, and that turned out not to happen. So we were kind of in a rushed position to make a decision based on what might happen, and so that was it. And it was also a decision that if we were to go forward with was going to be a decision that we'd have to make as far as, how we were going to come up with finances. Is this even the right? Is it even the right decision for us to disaffiliate versus just just getting out from under an old building? If we go this route, we have more issues to address. Yes.
You had a slide that showed ways that you can still
Yes.
disaffiliate. One of them was merging with other, compatible
Right.
denominations. What are the denominations like that in the language?
Couldn't hear.
Merging with other denominations. I haven't seen the list. There was actually a request was made of the bishop a year or so ago that whether the Global Methodist Church would be on that list. The bishop had to check on that, and he had to come back and rule it out of order because he said, I can't determine who's on the list, and the list was made before the Global Methodist Church existed. And the General Conference did not add them to the list. I believe, my guess is that like a local churches, probably the United Brethren Church on 180, that denomination I'm pretty sure would be on there. I don't know if there's a Wesleyan or a Free Methodist or any other church, any of those churches that are in the area, but I'm pretty sure that those churches, those denominations are also on the list. The list may be fairly long. I need to find it.
One of the, I know there's different kinds of Lutheran churches, but I thought one of the Lutheran churches, we were sort of in an association.
Yes, and that may be possible as well. Another thing that I mentioned there is there have been churches that have merged. We think about merging like we think about merging like with First United Methodist or whatever is something that was always something that we could explore. But churches sometimes merge with other churches across denominations, and when they do that, our system calls those federated churches, and typically that means usually that means that some agreement is reached on actually again releasing the church's property through the deed, and there may be some cost to that. I haven't been part of that, but both of those are ways to continue, to continue the church holding on to the property, but they really work well if you already have that relationship in place. I mean, a merger, just saying, let's merge with this church. Well, it would help if we knew them, and if we had a history together, we did some shared ministry together. That's what's happened usually, is those churches have had those kinds of relationships where it just seemed natural for them to come together. But those are other options we can explore. Yes.
I have to say this ahead of time. I'm a little like if I did try and get the words out and my thoughts together. So, now what I was going to say, is there a grievance process that we can make a grievance, I can say that word, to the district about, hey, we were not notified, or not notified, that it was not clear cut because a conference wasn't held at a certain time. So that's one thing I thought about. Second thing, regionalization. If our thoughts are more, I don't know if they are or not, because we all want to stay as a family, I feel. I don't know. That's what we talked about in the city council. But if regionalization, is there an option that we can join with another region, i.e. the African?
You asked about the regionalization. That's something that probably wouldn't be clear for several years. For one thing, we won't even in West Ohio, we won't even be voting on that until next year, and whether I'm not sure that possibly could make a difference, but I'm not sure if it would. That again, it would be talking about something that would be long development.
If we would think about if we were to go the global United Methodist, and that was on the list, does that mean we have to pay up the money for the mortgage and to pay for the pension and to pay for all, of that to get out if it's on the list of?
Yeah, I believe.
If you merge with a church,
Right.
then those funds, if it's sold, goes to the new church.
Right.
Is that what you're trying to say?
That's right. If for instance we merge with First, and so they're the only other, or merge with Pleasant View, for instance. if the two of our churches merged, and then we sold one or both of the properties, well, then that money would be in a capital fund that would be designated for building. I mean, we couldn't use it for anything else, but it would be ours to use.
But it wouldn't go.
It wouldn't go to the conference. It would be ours to use for future building if we did that, if we did a kind of merger. Now, question, and this is one area that I don't know if anybody else has more information. I do believe that, and I'm not sure, with the old disaffiliation process that just expired, I mean, what they were doing, reluctantly, they didn't want to, but because the General Conference had approved it, what they were was basically giving the churches a deal, I guess, if you would, that by paying their part of the pension liability and paying out proportionates and whatever else that they may have owed the church, the wider church, that they could leave with their property. Now, because they're not offering that anymore, is one side of that. I have heard rumblings, but I don't know if it's true, that the Global Methodist Church might offer some assistance, because they're still trying to assist churches in joining. However, it would also not be surprising to me if they didn't, because obviously that would be a cost that would be a cost that they would be bearing the cost to do that. So that may be an option. That's one thing about joining any other denomination. And I mean, I know pastors who do the same thing. I mean, they say, well, maybe I want to become a Lutheran, or I want to become a Free Methodist pastor. So, well, they also have to approve you. You'd say they have to decide that they want you, and so that's if we pursue that way, then that's something down the line. Another piece to all of this is that, and I was it turned out that after our council meeting Tuesday, I did have there's a regular Zoom meeting of several pastors who are in our conference. I should say, in West Ohio, we lost a lot of pastors through the disaffiliation. I mean, most of them went to Global Methodist, but a lot of it also has to do with so many of our pastors are near retirement. When I was at conference, it struck me that we have basically our representation. When we come together for conference, it's supposed to be half of its pastors and half of its lay representatives. So your representatives from each church. Well, we've got that, but there were 190 active pastors that were there, or that were on our total list. I mean, most of them would have been there. And there are 870 retired pastors. We have gotten so, our clergy end is so old that a lot of the people who make decisions for us now are pastors who are no longer serving anywhere, or can serve at their own whim. And a lot of the people were close to retirement, so they just retired. They moved on, and others joined the Global Methodist Church. The bottom line is that there's not a lot of leadership but there are a number of churches who are in our position, and some churches who actively feel like they're being held hostage, if you will. And I've heard other pastors who have said, one pastor who said even in his church, which is kind of divided, that he made a statement that he would not perform any same-sex wedding, that there were people in his congregation that were a little taken aback by that. And so they're still churches, many churches have a lot to discuss as far as that's concerned. But there are many churches who are all in a similar position. And I thought that morning, I even asked him, I said, I think one of the things that would be helpful is from some of you to come and talk with us, and just so we understand kind of where other churches and other people are at. And there are churches, we had some real, if we had pursued the question of disaffiliation, we had some real issues. For one thing, it said our pension liability was a little higher than some other churches. We have debt. Most smaller churches don't carry any debt, and so it was going to be a more complicated procedure for us. And there are other churches who just don't see this disaffiliation or disbanding as an option for them at all. And so they're kind of struggling with how to do it, or do I stay? So we're not the only ones who have that struggle. Yes, Larry.
2 points. First, just a commentary. If there was a pastor who did not want to marry a same-sex couple, then why on earth would the same-sex couple want someone to marry them?
That's a good question.
So, in other words, there are other reasons also why a pastor may choose not to perform a wedding service.
Sure.
There are numerous other things. That's not a big thing. The main point I wanted to share, it's just a seed of thought. The way I tend to work on things is I look at what my basic principles are, and I try to be consistent with those basic principles, to apply the basic principle to all the other side decisions. Like, what's my basic understanding of what Christ wants me to do, and then any other issue, social issue, whatever, I need to make sure it's compatible with that. So when I was reading up there that homosexuality is not compatible with Christian teaching, my first thought was, what aspect of Christian teaching is it not compatible with? Because my understanding is Jesus only gave us 2 commandments. Love God, love each other. Now, I think we're all fine with loving God. We each understand and connect to the Creator in our own way, our own path, our own value systems, whatever. That's great, we can connect. But loving each other, if we take a stand and it doesn't measure up to loving each other without little this or this proviso, loving each other doesn't have anything else in the way. If we can't make a decision that matches that, we're not doing what Christ would like us to do. That's just the thought, the way I understand it, the way I think and feel about it, that I wanted to share out, because you never know what thoughts are shared that end up percolating and make you think. So that's all.
And what you're expressing there is you're expressing that third point in the Bible thing. I mean, about how, yes, you believe that the Bible is relevant, but how you weigh different parts of the Bible. So again, not that I relish the conversation, but it's a conversation that may take us that can take us way far here.
This is my idea, my thought, and
All right. Nancy, were you?
Yes, not to get into the debate, I'm not going to, but Jesus also said, go and do not sin no more.
So again, that's exactly what we're doing. So
We're balanced.
My focus, I guess, is on how can we stay together as a family without people feeling that they are going against their consciences.
yeah.
And I'm going to throw out an idea. I don't know if it would match that or not. I remember in my youth, something happened at the East Ohio Conference that made the people in my own church very angry. And they decided to take a stand. They refused to pay apportionments. That's something we could do to show our displeasure, except we need to pay pastor's pension and possibly support the mission steps. And in addition to that, I don't think there's any rule against taking the words of United Methodist off our signs and bulletins. We could do that.
I've done that everywhere I've been at, and not because of this particular, but because to the outside world, United Methodist, I said the best church sign that I could imagine would be like a Maple Street Church. If you had the flaming cross, then that would mean something to people that mattered to. But everybody else, it doesn't matter. And if we'd called this church Maple Street Church at the beginning, we wouldn't have had to change the name 5 times.
Yeah.
Because we were the Maple Street Chapel of the United Evangelical Church, and then we were Maple Street Evangelical Church, and then we were Maple Street Evangelical United Brethren Church, and then we were the Maple Street United Methodist Church. And now if we decide to do something else, then we'll have to change the name again.
The third thing we could do is those people who want to could turn in a resignation of being a member of the United Methodist Church. They could still come here to
Yes.
our local church just the same. It's just a thought.
As I said, I wanted everyone to be informed on this, but my concern has always been when I came that to be able to follow, to help this church go where God leads, and I'm as I've mentioned before to many of you, I'm very suspicious of us being motivated just to get away from something. I believe more often than not God is leading us to something, and if that means like a neighbor of David's is an example of a church that was a smaller church, I assume probably our size or maybe even smaller, who just decided that they were spending too much money on building. I mean, just the question about we're putting this money in, but it's not. But only a portion of it is going to mission. Only a portion of it is going. So they decided to basically get rid of their building, and small enough to they had a member who had a big enough house, and that they could meet as a house church. That may seem like for many of us who have the visions of becoming this a grand larger church or whatever, or having this big ministry, that may seem counter to that, but that may be the future. That may be the future of the church in general, because with today being a bit of an exception, buildings like this aren't bringing in young people. They're not bringing in the next generation, and part of that may mean that churches need to look at new ways of doing things, so quite apart from this. And if our decision, and even that, understand that one of the things that I've been scared of over the years is that I be in the church that has to make some major decision, because I know when churches have even had to decide, when churches are growing and they have to decide to build a new church, people will leave. People. Anytime you take this is the bottom line, anytime, and this is what our General Conference has done every year, and you see it never works, because every time you take a vote, it doesn't solve anything. For years, we voted on those votes were 70% plus in favor of putting that language into the discipline. But it never resolved anything. Votes don't do it. Votes just divide us. Ultimately, what we want to do is find a way where that when we take a vote, it's pretty much a consensus that this is where we want to go. Yeah. Well, yes, Kate.
One of the things that bothers me is the
Let's see if I can give you some volume.
One of the things that bothers me is the fact that I watched the conference down in Charlotte, and I was very surprised at the attitude of the people that were running the conference and how they treated other people. To my way of thinking, it was far from being Christian. And everything seemed to have been all settled before any votes were taken. And if anybody objected to what they were voting on, they weren't given the proper opportunity to talk about it. They didn't want any discussion. They kept pushing things through. And one of my biggest concerns is not only with this situation, but going forward, is the changing of the words in the Bible. And that's something that they did, and something that I don't think that I would ever approve of.
Okay. And yes, it's definitely, there's a sense, I mean, I know persons, my father was one of them actually, who was very passionate about this issue and would have, and people have told me, I think your father would have been very happy at this moment. And I said, no, I'm not sure, because he had his particular way of things, but he didn't, I don't think he ever intended that we were going to change that, and he wanted those things dropped out of the discipline. He never approved of any of that stuff in the first place, but he never would have wanted it to leave because they got enough people out of the way that they were finally able to enforce their will. I mean, it wasn't. He would have wanted an argument. He would have wanted he would have wanted to reach an agreement and to be able to put in something that everybody would have agreed to. And instead, what our process has been kind of like our country's process is of simply siloing ourselves off from the rest of that. And I talked to other pastors who felt, like I said, when our annual conference met, that they felt, it's like the leadership doesn't even know we're here, and we're probably 30 to 40% of the United Methodist Church out there. We're just not the majority anymore, but as far as but they act like we no longer exist. And that's where a lot of my colleagues are feeling right now. And like I said, some of them wouldn't even have this conversation just because they don't see it possibly leading anywhere. I think for us, I think for not only is it fruitful for us, but I think that just given the other issues, the older building, our own look at a future of how does this church, I want to die and this church still be alive, right? And that's, so I told some people, I knew when I came to Maple Street that I'm supposed to be prepared to die. I want to offer something lasting here. But for those reasons alone, that I believe we have to have these conversations. And so this is just part of that bigger conversation of where God's leading us.
Interesting thought that made me come up with. I have a friend that's at the Presbyterian Church in Coshocton, and whenever they lose a pastor, before they get a new one, they do a congregational kind of a search as to who we are, what do we need, where do we want to go, et cetera,
Yes.
so they get the right person for who they recognize themselves to be. And as you pointed out, Kevin, there's not just this one particular issue. There are other things that if we're looking to where God is pointing us to go, then we need to consider all sorts of things, which might not be a bad thing, including our building, the cost that goes into this. Just like I suggested to the leader of the Boy Scouts, the national movement, that the scouting movement today is about 800,000 boys, and when I was in there, it was 4.5 million. So the structure is set up for this number, but this is what you got now. So why not just take a look fresh? If this is who we are serving, how do we need to set things up? We might do a similar self-searching, not that might be spurred because of this particular issue, to look at what do we need to thrive with what we are, who we are, et cetera, et cetera. That could be moving us toward a place instead of reacting. And I want to share one other thing too. As I said, my scripture is love each other. That's what Jesus said. So, and one of the thoughts I had was, well, what if my family decides that my brother-in-law is no good because he is homosexual, and that his long-term committed relationship, which has lasted longer than most marriages, is not appropriate? What if my family can't celebrate the love of these people? Then I like Jesus wants me to, then that means that if this congregation decided to leave because they don't want to have anything to do with people like my brother-in-law, I'd stay with them.
Yeah.
Loving doesn't mean we have to condone actions.
Well, but I think the point that you're making is too that, I mean, it's just like it's just like persons that expressed this to me when we first started talking about, okay, we need to talk about this disaffiliation, that if we vote, voting is winners and losers. I mean, that's, which for a family is losers and losers. I mean, regardless of how this goes, and that's what churches are seeing now. I mean, one of my other pastors that said that was in this meeting, it said, one of our AV guys, he just said, well, I'm going to go check out this other global Methodist church down the road and see how that fits. He might come back to their church, he might not. But that's where people, we have our individual reasons for being here, right? And we have our own sensibilities about, again, the question, for some people, what happens to the church out there where in German Village, where there's a big gay population and stuff, if they do some things that I don't agree with, I'm not happy with it, but they're also not telling me how to do things where I'm at. So we kind of live together with that, with that assumption. And some people are okay with that, and some people are not. So what we have, represented in this room, don't be fooled when we think we should just vote on this, because how many people are in this room? That's how many different opinions we have, right? We're even on just this issue alone, we are probably not 100% on every aspect of this. And so that's something that if we want to pursue that we need to be willing to talk through. Yes.
There are so many strong dynamics come together at the same time
Yes.
that it's really hard to prioritize. As I was trying to say, was so many dynamics coming at us all at once. It's really hard to prioritize. And I can say now that we are not a United Methodist Church, because we're not united. We're a Methodist church.
Hold the microphone close.
Yeah.
Still can't hear you.
Still can't hear me.
Yeah.
Speak
No,
up,
you're,
kind of close.
yeah.
Well, anyway, as I said, we're not United Methodist Church any longer. We're just a Methodist church. So they're using a name that is all-inclusive, but we're not included. We're not included. We're not even included in their decisions. Everything was a fait accompli. Now, if we want to really challenge this, and I would ask Kevin this, there may be an avenue where we could provide an ecclesiastical amicus letter to the courts, the Methodist courts, and ask them to explain themselves in the court, since we're not given any voice prior to this. And they seem to be the ones saying that the scriptures, which we all put our faith in and draw our faith and strength from, who gets to decide which scripture is more important than another scripture, or discount one altogether? So we have to first prioritize one of these dynamics. I would say this church is the first thing. This building, this 100-year-old building. And once we come down to a decision as to what to do with that, it makes it a little easier to deal with where we're going to show up next. As a church, a Methodist church, or global church, or are we going to remain as a group? But I believe that these dynamics have to be sorted out, because it makes it very confusing when you're talking about these things. Because you overlap one over another. And I think what we need to do is sort that out. And from my own opinion, I don't put one scripture above another scripture. It's either all or nothing. And I don't understand why, when there's opportunities in the civil side for gay marriage, that it's a necessity that they be married in a Methodist church. They have their options. And this country's built on separation of church and state. I mean, are we going to make the Masons change their rules? The Knights of Columbus, the Oddfellows, all the service groups, Rotary, and all that? Because they're not in line with the civil section? Just because civil life has changed on us does not mean that we have to change with it. The other countries around the world that Methodism is in are not in line with their laws. So there's a lot of reason for us to challenge this. As small as we are, the mustard seeds in the congregation, the larger congregation, I think we do have an avenue to charge in the courts and challenge the decisions of the conference, since they didn't ask us in the first place.
Okay, so so what Tom brings up is that there are other battles. I mean, it is a matter of picking our battles, isn't it? Because there's a lot of different ways that. I mean, one thing is for us is the typical church, as I said, doesn't discuss these things, and yes, I would encourage anybody who needs to go to. I mean, that was always my thought, is you could leave as you need to, but that the typical church that either sweeps these things under the rug or doesn't want to address them, addresses them by inaction, and what happens is that the decision ultimately gets made by not deciding. Like for our church, that's been this whole year has been bombarded with building issues and so forth that have taken a great deal of our money, and then the distress over all of this stuff. I don't ever believe that it's helpful to skirt the issues or sweep them under the rug in that sense. And I'd also like to believe that we find that even where we think that we disagree, that we have a lot more in common than we think. I found that over and over again where people, because as I've said, and you probably heard me say this time and time, you can always look any time that you have an ongoing issue with another point of view or another group. Well, then it's a fair bet that it's because you're wrong about something. And I recognize that I often said I'm wrong about something. Usually, the first place to look is my assumptions about the other side, because a lot of times what I've found over and over again is that people are arguing with, they're making assumptions about who they're arguing with or the point of view of the other person, and realize that's not quite what they actually believe. There's that we have been here and you all have been together as a family, but there have been persons who have left over the years. You have stayed here not just because you're family. I mean, you found that there's been commonality in there that you've been comfortable with, even as there's been other things that you haven't. And so it is my hope and my prayer that we can realize that while if we were to come to a vote, like if we were to come to a vote right now, I don't think that we're really well enough informed of all the issues that it would be a fair vote. And the fact that there are people who may